the basal ganglia nobody taught you, and why that was intentional. In the winter of 1916, patients across Europe began freezing mid-motion, some for 40 years, after an epidemic attacked one small cluster of neurons deep in the brain. And neuroscientists still cannot fully explain what triggered it, or why medicine spent half a century refusing to say its name. The disease was called Encephalitis lethargica. Doctors nicknamed it sleepy sickness. Between 1915 and 1926, it swept through hospitals in Vienna, Paris, London, New York. Nearly 1 million people affected, a third of them dead within months. The survivors were stranger than the dead. Some lay motionless for years, eyes open, aware, unable to initiate a single voluntary movement. Neurologist Konstantin von Economo traced the damage to a structure most doctors of his era had never been taught to examine closely: the basal ganglia, a set of nuclei buried beneath the cortex, responsible not for thought, but for something colder, the switch that lets thought become motion. The first anomaly was this: these patients could still think. They could hear a question and know the answer. Some later described, in vivid detail, entire conversations that happened around their motionless bodies for years. Their basal ganglia, not their consciousness, had failed. The wanting was intact. The doing was gone. A structure smaller than a walnut had severed the bridge between intention and action, and it did so with surgical precision, sparing memory, language, even personality. Doctors had no name for a disorder that left the mind fully lit while the body sat dark. So they filed it under psychiatry instead of neurology and stopped looking. The obvious theory for decades was that this was simply catatonic schizophrenia, a disease of the mind, not the brain. It was a convenient label. Psychiatric wards absorbed thousands of post-encephalitic patients through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, medicating them for a mental illness they didn't have. Medical schools taught the basal ganglia as a footnote, a relay station for movement, nothing more. Textbooks moved on. An entire generation of neurologists graduated never learning what this structure actually governed, because the one epidemic that would have taught them had already been quietly reclassified as insanity. But in 1969, at a chronic care hospital in the Bronx, a young neurologist named Oliver Sacks broke that theory completely. He gave a handful of long-frozen survivors a new drug, L-Dopa, designed to restore dopamine to the basal ganglia. Patients who had not moved since the Coolidge administration stood up. They spoke. They asked what year it was. One woman, motionless for 32 years, requested a cup of tea. If this had been psychiatric illness, dopamine should have done nothing. It didn't just help, it proved the basal ganglia wasn't a footnote. It was the gate between will and world, and it had been misfiled for half a century by institutions that found incurable madness easier to accept than "we don't understand this structure." Here is the detail that still unsettles the researchers who study it. The awakenings didn't last. Within weeks, most patients relapsed, not into stillness, but into violent tics, spasms, and psychosis, as if the same circuit that unlocked motion had no working middle setting. It could be frozen shut or thrown wide open, nothing in between. Sacks documented patients begging to be frozen again rather than endure the chaos of an overcorrected brain. Nobody has ever fully explained why a single structure restored would overshoot so catastrophically, why there was no gentle return, only two extremes. Some researchers blamed dosage. Others blamed decades of neural atrophy from disuse. Neither explains why the crashes were often just as sudden as the awakenings, sometimes within hours, with no clear dosage threshold. A viral cause was proposed, a link to the 1918 influenza pandemic circling the globe at the same time. Brain tissue samples, re-examined decades later with modern methods, found no consistent viral signature. An autoimmune theory followed, the body's own defenses turning on basal ganglia tissue after a streptococcal infection, the same mechanism now suspected in a modern childhood disorder called PANDAS. It fits some cases. It fails to explain why the epidemic vanished as abruptly as it arrived in 1926 and never returned in that form again. To this day, no textbook fully accounts for what encephalitis lethargica actually was, why it targeted this one structure with such precision, or why the medical establishment chose, for 50 years, not to ask. The basal ganglia sits in every human skull, quietly deciding which intentions get to become actions. What decided in 1926 to let it go still standing and unexplained, nobody has ever been able to say.